Dr. CRASKE, can you describe to us how the inhibitory learning model of exposure differs from other models of the change process in exposure treatment? That is, models of habituation and models of emotional processing.
Right. So when I think of the inhibitory learning model, there are three basic principles that sort of drive the model. One is, as I said, exposure is a learning process. And so what is critical for this to work is to identify for each person as they are coming in for treatment, what is it that they need to learn? So it's very much focused on a functional analysis of what that person needs to learn. And how to then design the exposure in a way that will maximize the strength of that learning, as I was just describing.
Mm-hmm.
And then third, that while the reduction of fear throughout exposure therapy typically does occur, in and of itself, fear reduction may not be the index of whether this new learning is actually happening and how strong that new learning will be in the future. So that they are the principles. Now let's see, how does this differ from the two basic models of habituation and emotional processing theory? So clearly habituation models of exposure therapy focus on fear reduction, so reducing the strength of the fear response as the person proceeds through exposure therapy. And that's why when I was initially trained too, the goal was have the individual stay in the exposure situation until fear declines.
Yeah.
That was the kind of clinical law, right?
Yep.
And with the idea being that if it doesn't decline, then maybe you're doing something terribly wrong.
Or maybe they're not learning anything.
Or maybe they're not learning anything. In the inhibitory learning model, fear reduction in and of itself is not the primary driving force of how to do exposure therapy. It may happen, and it usually does happen, but it doesn't have to be the case. So many experimental studies that we've conducted, fear does not habituate throughout the given exposure trial, and yet the person's doing well in the long term.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we've tended to shift away from fear reduction in and of itself, with the basic notion being for a given person, what they may need to learn is something independent of whether fear reduces. They may need to learn, in fact, that they can survive fear being elevated for prolonged periods of time. And in that case, fear reduction would not be a good goal because they're not learning what they need to learn.
Mm-hmm.
Emotional processing theory, which is a magnificent theory in many ways, and I think has been useful in moving our field forward, in providing a framework, has, in the way I see emotional processing theory, has two components. It has, first of all, the habituation component, which is that you want fear to habituate within a given trial of exposure. That's called within-session habituation.
Uh-huh.
Then you want fear to habituate across trials of exposure. That's between-session habituation. And then that allows corrective learning to take place, which is a shift in the person's meaning that they give to the stimulus, whether they now perceive the stimulus as less dangerous or less overwhelming. That second component, the corrective learning component, has more to do, or I see that as having much more overlap with this inhibitory learning model approach.
Mm-hmm.
The initial component, the fear habituation, has much less to do with the inhibitory learning approach.